Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Jewish Drinking the Show, and I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and today we have a guest on, Professor John Bergsma, and we're going to be talking about the first episode in the entire Bible discussing drinking, and Professor Bergsma I've brought on because he has written a really fascinating article on this topic. Professor Bergsma, do you mind telling us about who you are and where you are?
Absolutely. So I am an Old Testament scholar at a Catholic university. It's called Franciscan University of Steubenville. I teach Bible for a living. I love it. I am a specialist in the Pentateuch or the Torah. I've written scholarly papers on different aspects of the books of Moses and their relationship to the prophets. I love this material. It's sacred to both our religious traditions, and it's life-giving. It's really life-giving. So I love talking about it. So I've been teaching for 15 years here. We produce a lot of religious educators at this school for the Catholic Church in the United States. I have many children. I've got 8 kids, 4 of whom are adults. Yes, my quiver is, well, not quite full. I think I need 15 to be full. But I live with my wife and our younger children right here in Steubenville, which is kind of in the Pittsburgh area for folks that may not have heard of it. It's just over the border into Ohio if you drive straight west from Pittsburgh for about an hour.
All right. Go Ohio.
Woo. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, we're Buckeyes fans here.
We're state mates. We're both in Ohio.
That's right. Yeah, we could. Other ends of the state, but yeah, we're definitely a Buckeye territory all the way across. Yep. Okay.
All right. Are you drinking anything this morning?
Not this early in the morning.
All right.
Maybe later.
Normally I'd reach for a coffee, but I'm just sticking with hydration for the moment. But
okay.
It's a drinking show.
Exactly. I understand. I had my coffee already.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome. All right, so this morning we're discussing the very first instance of drinking in the entirety of the Bible, and that would occur in Genesis 9, verses 18 through 27. And so for those less familiar with this story, I know there are some out watching or listening to this video or podcast. Some may be really familiar, and some may be less so, or maybe have heard of it, but vaguely unaware. So here's the basic outline for those less familiar: is Noah and his sons and all the animals have been out to sea for weeks on end. They finally hit dry land. They come out, and Noah plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk, and something happens, which I am intentionally leaving ambiguous. And then he curses a son, and then he blesses some of his other sons, and that's sort of that's basically what happens. That's the very first thing that happens once they hit dry land. So there are problems, though. I think anybody reading just doing a cursory read, just doing a straight read of this text, has some questions, has some quandaries, and that's what we're getting into in this episode. So I think the very first thing that appeared, I think one of those strange things, it's not a big thing, but a strange thing in the very first verse in 18 notifies us that Hahn is the father of Canaan. Now, we have a lot of genealogical aspects here in Genesis, lots of so-and-so was the father and so-and-so, but here it just sort of, it sticks out. We don't really know what to do with it. But we get to verse 20, which is Noah, who is a man of the soil, and he plants a vineyard. So I want to pause us here, which is there's an ambiguity also with the verb vayachel Noah, which is Noah began, which I don't know what you've come across, Professor Bergsma. Have you come across various translations of what vayachel could be here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the translation in English that I usually use in teaching actually renders it, he was the first tiller of the soil. I don't think that, I mean, my personal opinion, and we could discuss it, but first of all, I don't think that's the sense of the verse. I think it's just that he began to be a farmer, essentially. He began to be a man of the Adamah. And we should recall that Adam, in a sense, was a man of the Adamah too. He was sent in to work the soil, and Cain was as well. Earlier, he brought some of the fruit of the soil, the Adamah, in offering to God back in an earlier passage. So I. One of the things that the text is doing is signaling this continuity in some way, between Adam, Cain, and Noah. Um, and where exactly that's going is interesting, but I don't want to get off on a rabbit trail. I did write a, uh, a essay on the theology of work in the book of Genesis, which I kind of like it actually what I worked on there. That as you know, Rabbi, avad can be both work and worship, right? And
Yeah.
and the in Genesis 2:15, when it talks about Adam being placed in the garden to work and to guard, to shamar and avad, these are words that are used together later in Numbers to describe the priests and Levites who work in the sanctuary. And so there's this long tradition of Adam as a priest.
Ah,
And so, but for Adam, there's no distinction between his avad, his labor, and his avad, his liturgy or his worship. There's this unity of work and worship in the Garden of Eden, which gets profaned and separated when he rejects the word of the Lord. But I think that the human vocation is to reunite work and worship. But here we're getting way off onto another topic. But I would
okay.
translate he began to be a man of the soil. And that might have a slightly negative connotation. I'm not sure, because Cain was a worker of the soul as well. I'm not sure, but maybe we should resist reading too much into it initially.
Yeah. Great. I appreciate that. That's really neat. I'll get the information for you for that article. I'll put it down here in the description.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
So I've come across a few interpretations. One, some people may be familiar with of Rashi, of understanding Chol here being the opposite of Kodesh. So that Noah was on a holy level when he was in the Teva in the ark, and then he debased himself. He hit land, and he hit land like really hard, and he just debased himself by getting drunk. Like that basically, like, he was on a holy level, and then he got drunk by hitting land, and it was that's one possibility. That's a
Right.
negative valence to what this word could be.
Right.
There could be another, which is like hit lahatchil vayitchal, that he began, right? Not chol as in the opposite of kodesh, but hitchil in the hitbael, of the reflexive of he began, which I know you mentioned, Professor Bergsma, of this is something that he began doing. He became an isha adama, that he became a man of the, having been float literally
Right.
out to sea. This is something he began. It was like an identity transformation he began doing.
Hmm.
A totally different way of reading the beginning aspect is he was the very first. He began to plant a vineyard. That he was the first one to ever do it, and that it could come from his being Ish Hadamah, which I also tend to think it either, when you read the Ish Hadamah, is it that he began to be an Ish Hadamah, or that he had been an Ish Hadamah, that he was a man of the earth. And you think about this terrible tragedy of this, like, an earthly person being sent out to sea for weeks on end, but that he, with his knowledge, he was the very first to begin planting vineyards, because we've never seen anybody drink or have a vineyard previous to chapter 9 in Genesis. So he could have been the very first one to institute it.
Yeah.
So
That's
I think there's like, you could go from the negative of the Rashi read to the more just like he was an agricultural innovator. Like,
right.
there's different valences we can read.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. And you have to make your choice in light of the larger context and where you think the narrative's going. Yeah.
Right. And some people like the seeing Noah as getting drunk, as debasing himself. They say, "Oh yeah, drinking is just about debasing yourself," and they're happy to read this in a negative light. But I think that doesn't jive with everybody's read of this.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right. So the very next verse, he drank of this wine. He gets drunk, and then he becomes uncovered. Vayitchal b'toch ahalo. He gets naked in his tent, whatever that means. and we're going to leave that ambiguously open to interpretation. And then 22, Ham, the father of Canaan, again, that pops in, the genealogical aspect pops in, and he sees the nakedness of his father, and then he tells his two brothers who are outside, and then his two brothers, Shem and Japhet, come, take a cloth, cover their father. Now here we get to the exciting part. 24, Vaikatz Noach Mieno. Noach wakes up from his wine, and he knows Vaida et Asher Aselo Beno Hakatan, whatever his little son. We don't know what the little son is, who that is, but he knows what it is. So just on the superficial read of this, what do we get from this, Professor Bergsma?
What are we getting? Well, it sounds like, okay, the plain literal sense, without much context, without bringing in the polyvalence or the possible double entendres of some of the terms here, sounds like Noah gets drunk and naked. His son Ham looks at him and laughs about it and tells his brothers. His other brothers have better filial piety, you might say, better respect for the dignity of their dad, so they don't want to see his nakedness. They cover him up, and then when Noah wakes up, he oddly doesn't curse Ham, who's the actual offender. He curses Ham's youngest son, Canaan, and that's really odd. And has developed there's a whole interpretive tradition trying to figure out why isn't it that Ham doesn't get directly cursed, for that. But that's how it goes. The older brothers get blessed. Ham doesn't get cursed. Oddly, his son gets cursed.
Right. So for this superficial read, it's a problem of how come Canaan, who seemingly is not involved at all in the incident, gets cursed, but yet Ham gets away scotch-free. It's unclear.
Yeah.
Clearly, Shem and Japhet getting blessed, that makes sense. They did good things. So that's, I think, the lacking of this superficial read.
Right.
Right. Okay. So then there are a couple more reads. So the rabbis were not happy with just the superficial read. They found problems, like clearly something more heinous must have occurred, because just having been seen while naked and drunk and asleep, you don't really necessarily know that someone saw you, but the rabbis pick up on verse 24 and knowing what had been done to him. It sounds like there's some residual effects that he realizes that it happened to him in a physical sense.
Right.
And so the rabbis pick up in Sanhedrin 70, and Rav and Shmuel, some early 3rd century Amoraim, pick up and they say, you know what? Here's a couple possibilities. And so one said that it was castration, right? That's something that he wakes up, he clearly knows.
You would know about that.
You would know about that, right? And you would be really, really upset.
You would be.
You'd be really upset. And the other one says no, he had been whatever, penetrated, abused, something of a devastating sexual nature.
Right.
Right. And it's fascinating because the castration one, whichever, either Rav or Shmuel, whoever advocated this one, it kind of can make sense why he's cursing Canaan, because if Canaan is the son of Ham, so Noach, who can clearly no longer father any more children, he can curse Ham, who is now having children, right? And Canaan, who's an offspring. So that can kind of make sense.
Right.
But yet it doesn't explain why Ham is not being cursed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions as to the justification for the other model of the abuse model, the sexual abuse model?
Well, sure. I think the sexual abuse model is on the right track in the sense that, recognizing that whatever Ham did was more serious than just a look. It's asalo. It was done to him. It sounds like a deed. So an act of aggression, right? So I think it's on the right track in terms of trying to figure out, well, something more serious was done to Noah that requires some explanation. The weakness, though, seems to be that we're we're grasping a little bit for what that deed might be. It would be better if there was a textual hint or a textual clue that would lead us in the direction of identifying the deed that was done. And
Right.
I think eventually there is, as we'll talk about later. But you know, again, on the right track, but neither castration nor male penetration is suggested in the language here. So that's we're kind of you know grabbing something out of a hat that kind of will suit as a grave offense, but is not suggested by the text.
Well, and now we're starting to transition to some breadcrumbs towards the hints of the fourth possibility, which I know you and Professor Hahn discussed, which in your article you did talk about some other scholars out there proposing that that model of the paternal incest or the paternal penetration, that there are some textual hints later on in Leviticus, right?
Right.
About the nakedness.
Exactly. Sure. So, this precisely, and let's go there. So the language that's used here, it says that Ham saw the nakedness of his father. Um, and when we look in Leviticus 20, we find that this phrase, to see the nakedness, is a literary device, or call it a euphemism. Um, it's a set phrase in Hebrew that indicates intercourse. It's functionally equivalent to the phrase "uncover the nakedness of." So either to see the nakedness of or to uncover the nakedness of, they mean the same thing, and they're used seeing the nakedness is used in Leviticus 20, which corresponds to Leviticus 18. The two chapters are closely related. Leviticus 18 describes forbidden sexual relations, and Leviticus 20 specifies the punishments for those forbidden relationships. So yeah, so seeing the nakedness of the father, this was a euphemism for sexual activity, and so there is a hint, that there was a sexual offense here. Although I think that we can do a little bit better job than saying like a paternal, a father-son sexual offense.
Yeah. So my question to you is, so now I know you have a fourth possibility, a fourth reading, and one that does jive with this language in Leviticus. Before we get there, how did you and Professor Hahn like think about this and arrive at this conclusion? What was the
Sure.
process?
Yeah, the process. So again, we're assuming that as the rabbis did and as the church fathers did, there's an assumption that the text makes sense, right? There's an assumption that God knows what He's doing in revealing this, etc. So we're looking for the sense that exists in the text. Um, so among critical scholars, among like professional Bible scholars, there's an instinct um, to fix the text by appeal to what we call source criticism. So folks will say, um, the problems in the text arise because somebody put together some old legends and bungled it. You know. Well, anyway, that kind of avenue for explaining the text is not something I'm interested in going there, and neither is Dr. Hahn. I think you end up causing so much confusion. It's worse than anything you start with. But anyway, so there's we're working with the presumption that there's a sense of the text, and Genesis 9:20 highlights. Here, I'm looking at Leviticus 9:20. Sorry, that's the problem. Genesis 9:20 and following highlights this fact of Ham being the father of Canaan, and it
Yeah.
really calls attention to it twice,
Yeah.
unnecessarily so. Both in verse 18 and then again in verse 22, where there's no reason to mention that in verse 22. We just a few verses ahead. We were informed that he's the father of Canaan, and again, this is mentioned. and then of course Canaan ends up being mentioned at the end. So this suggests that somehow this story is related to Ham's fatherhood of Canaan. Otherwise, why would the text be highlighting this so repeatedly? And that was part of our thought process as we were working on this. This is one of the biggest cruxes or like interpretive difficulties in the book of Genesis, this passage. And we figured if we could work on this and provide a reasonable solution for it, it would encourage people to think that, oh, well, if that conundrum can be solved, then maybe there are avenues for a lot of the other, interpretive cruxes that we find in Scripture and in the Pentateuch in particular. So we thought, let's tackle this one and work through it. Yeah, and so the language of sexual offense, the highlighting of Canaan's fatherhood of Ham's fatherhood of Canaan. These were clues for us toward what we believe is the solution of the passage. And then when we started researching the literature, we found that about 50 years before we were working on this, a scholar had proposed a form of the solution that we eventually adopted and ran with. So that was very interesting. But we felt like that scholar, a couple generations before, it hadn't pulled it all together. He had kind of motioned in the direction of the right solution, but hadn't produced a really tight argument. And so his work got basically ignored. He was rarely cited, or if he was cited, people would just dismiss it because they think he didn't complete and kind of nail down the whole exegetical argument.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's really neat. So, all right, should we get into it?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So, Professor Bergsma, so what is this fourth possibility? This fourth interpretive possibility?
Yeah, well, it's maternal incest, okay? Because as we talked about, Rabbi, this phrase "to see the nakedness of," it's a euphemism for sexual activity. But when you actually look in Leviticus 20 and 18, where this phrase, as well as the equivalent phrase, which is to uncover nakedness, you look at the way it's used, and then the nakedness of the father is actually stated to be the nakedness of the mother. Okay, so an equivalence is made quite very explicitly in Leviticus 18 that the nakedness of the father is actually the nakedness of the mother. So what's prohibited in Leviticus 18 is not physical relations between father and son, which in most cultures are so abhorrent anyway that nobody would really do that. But it's really a relationship between the son and his mother, or the father's wife. Remembering that at this stage, this is a polygamous ancient culture, and so your father might be married to someone who's not your mother, and so both physical relations with your mother as well as any of your other father's wives are prohibited. And the way it's phrased is, "You shall not uncover your father's nakedness," and then an equivalence is made between the mother's nakedness or the nakedness of the father's wife with the father's nakedness. So here's where we're getting textual clues to put it all together. So the term father's nakedness in Genesis 20 through 27, we have scriptural basis to take that as an equivalence to mother's nakedness, or well, this would be mother's nakedness because there's only one wife of Noah here. And then seeing the nakedness is also essentially defined as a sexual act in Leviticus 20. So if we put that all together, then we can say that if you understand the multiple meanings of these terms, if you understand what we call the polyvalence of the terms in light of how they're used in the rest of the books of Moses, what's being suggested here is that Ham has intimacy with Noah's wife, his own mother, and this then would explain why Ham is the father of Canaan. Okay, This is why it's
Yeah.
being called attention, because this is what we call an etiological narrative. It's a narrative that explains how the origins. And remember, this is Bereshith. This is the book of origins. This is about how all the different groups get started, right? And
Yeah.
so we have accounts of how Moab and Ammon get their start with Lot, which also involves drunkenness, interestingly,
Yeah.
later. And we get an account of how Judah gets its start in with the Tamar episode, Perez
Yeah.
and Zerah, and so on. That's a
Yeah.
really dicey, sketchy episode there
But
as
there's no
well.
drinking in that one.
No, there is. So Judah has less of an excuse.
Yeah.
Anyway, um, so we get accounts, and so this, I think this is a genealogical account of the origins of Canaan. Canaan arises from this relationship between Ham and his father's wife, his mother. And another thing, Rabbi, we also know that uh, as unpleasant as it is to say, but sleeping with the father's wife was a way of socially indicating that you were taking over the clan. And we
Right.
see Reuben attempting to do this later in Genesis, and he gets severely rebuked from Yaakov for doing that. And also we see Absalom attempting that later when we get into the books of Samuel, 2 Samuel 15 or thereabouts, as a social statement that I'm taking over for my father. He sleeps with David's concubines. And so that would make sense. So this act, Ham takes advantage of his father's weakness and his father's drunkenness to have intimacy. And that was a sign that I'm taking over the family group. I'm taking my father's place because he's as good as, good as dead, really.
Yes.
Yeah, so it kind of all makes sense. And it fits with a pattern that we see in Scripture.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating is the connection here between Lot and his daughters and Noah and his sons is also like you said, the generative aspects of these nations. And it's not just random nations out there, but they're eventually lands that get taken over by Bnei Israel, by the Israelites of Ammon, Moab, and then of course Canaan. And I
Right.
think another fascinating textual connection is in the third verse in chapter 18 of all the various sexual prohibitions that the land of Canaan regularly practices these things, right? And so one of these
Yes.
things is found in verses 7 and 8 in chapter 18. So it's very connected to Canaan again.
It is absolutely. You shall not practice what the Egyptians or the Canaanites do. It says, oh, am I just misremembering that? I'm looking at the top of 18. It's definitely as in the land of Canaan.
It's
Yeah.
18:3. It's the land you came from in Egypt and the land you're going to in Canaan.
Ah, that's right. And Egypt is the land of Ham, right? So,
Oh yeah.
right. So these are sexual practices characteristic of this. And to a certain extent, archaeology has borne this out because this uh, intrafamilial sexual relations was practiced among the pharaohs. Tut, for example, and Akhenaton were married to sisters. So this this really was. I mean, it's as distasteful as it is to talk about this. There's the Leviticus is not making it up that these were actually characteristic cultural practices.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah, good.
awesome. Well, this is really great, and this is really great to help. Well, I enjoyed your article over a decade ago when I first read it, but for those being exposed to this, whether on video or podcast, I hope this is really, it's actually in this week's Torah reading and the Parshas Noah, so it's very timely.
Yeah, excellent, excellent, good.
Yeah. All right. So thank you again, Professor Bergsma. If people wanted to read more of like some of your writings out there, in addition to the couple writings we already mentioned, what recent publications have you worked on?
Sure. Well, I just came out with a book from Penguin Random House called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Wow.
revealing the Jewish roots of Christianity. And I think Jewish readers would really be interested in picking it up because it shows how much more interconnected our faiths are than we realize. And a lot of Christian practices, for example, the traditional seven sacraments of Christianity and so on, I think neither Christians nor Jews realize how rooted those practices are in what we call Second Temple Judaism or late ancient Judaism. So, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were left to us by the Jewish group called the Essenes. It was one of the branches of Second Temple Judaism, along with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And they're just a fascinating group. And I think, as I said, I think the readers will be interested because they show the kind of Judaism from which many early Christian practices, I believe, developed.
Wow, that's really great.
Yeah.
And what's that called again?
That's called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Awesome.
revealing the Jewish roots of Christianity from Penguin Random House. So
Cool.
I think, yeah, you might find a fun read.
Is that out already?
It is. Yeah, it came out about a month ago.
Oh, great.
So you
Great.
can find it at Walden Books and Barnes and Noble or Amazon or whatever.
Thank you so much, Professor Bergsma. This is really fantastic. I appreciate your time. And I don't know, l'chaim.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hope we have a chance to do it again. Take care now.
Absolutely. Thank you.